On April 1st, during the second day of my journey to base camp, I was surprised to run into February Hackland and to clerk on the trail below Namche Bazaar, walking out of the mountains, bound for Kathmandu. De Klerk, a friend of mine, informed me that the three South African climbers and Charlotte Noble, their team's doctor, had resigned from the expedition before even getting to the base of the mountain. Woodall, the leader, turned out to be a complete asshole, explained de Klerk. A total control freak. And you couldn't trust him. We never knew if he was talking bullshit or telling the truth. We didn't want to put our lives in the hands of a guy like that. So we left. Woodall had made claims to de Klerk and others that he'd climbed extensively in the Himalaya, including ascents above 26,000 feet. In fact, the whole of Woodall's Himalayan mountaineering experience consisted of his participation as a paying client on two unsuccessful expeditions led by Mal Duff. In 1989, Woodall failed to reach the summit of Modest Island Peak, and in 1990, he was rebuffed at 21,300 feet on Annapurna, still a vertical mile beneath the top. Additionally, before leaving for Everest, Woodall had boasted on the expedition's internet website of a distinguished military career in which he'd risen through the ranks of the British Army to command the elite long-range mountain reconnaissance unit that did much of its training in the Himalayas. He told the Sunday Times that he had been an instructor at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, England, as well. As it happens, there is no such thing as a long-range mountain reconnaissance unit in the British Army, and Woodall never served as an instructor at Sandhurst, nor did he ever fight behind enemy lines in Angola. According to a spokesman for the British Army, Woodall served as a pay clerk. Woodall also lied about whom he'd listed on the Everest climbing permit issued by the Nepalese Ministry of Tourism. From the beginning, he'd said that both Kathy O'Dowd and Deshun Desel were on the permit and that the final decision about which woman would be invited to join the climbing team would be made at base camp. After leaving the expedition, de Klerk discovered that O'Dowd was listed on the permit, as well as Woodall's 69-year-old father and a Frenchman named Terry Renard, who'd paid Woodall $35,000 to join the South African team, but Deshun Desel, the only black member after the resignation of Ed February, was not. This suggested to de Klerk that Woodall had never had any intention of letting Desel climb the mountain. Adding insult to injury, before leaving South Africa, Woodall had cautioned de Klerk, who is married to an American woman and has dual citizenship, that he would not be allowed on the expedition unless he agreed to use his South African passport to enter Nepal. He made a big fuss about it, recalls de Klerk, because we were the first South African Everest expedition and all that. But it turns out that Woodall doesn't hold a South African passport himself. He's not even a South African citizen. The guy's a Brit, and he entered Nepal on his British passport. Woodall's numerous deceits became an international scandal, reported on the front pages of newspapers throughout the British Commonwealth. As the negative press filtered back to him, the megalomaniacal leader turned a cold shoulder to the criticism and insulated his team as much as possible from the other expeditions. He also banished Sunday Times reporter Ken Vernon and photographer Richard Shorey from the expedition, even though Woodall had signed a contract stipulating that in return for receiving financial backing from a newspaper, the two journalists would be allowed to accompany the expedition at all times, and that failure to honor this stipulation would be cause for breach of contract. The editor of the Sunday Times. Ken Owen was en route to base camp with his wife at the time, midway through a trekking vacation that had been arranged to coincide with the South African Everest expedition and was being led by Woodall's girlfriend, a young Frenchwoman named Alexandra Gaudin. In Farish, Owen learned that Woodall had given the boot to his reporter and photographer. Flabbergasted, he sent a note to the expedition leader explaining that the newspaper had no intention of pulling Vernon and Shorey from the story and that the journalist had been ordered to rejoin the expedition. When Woodall received this message, he flew into a rage and rushed down to Farish from base camp to have it out with Owen. According to Owen, during the ensuing confrontation, he asked Woodall point-blank if Desel's name was on the permit. Woodall replied, "That's none of your business." When Owen suggested that Daysel had been reduced to serving as a token black woman to give the team a spurious South Africanism, Woodall threatened to kill both Owen and his wife. At one point, the overwrought expedition leader declared, "I'm going to rip your head off and ram it up your arse." Shortly thereafter, journalist Ken Vernon arrived at the South African base camp, an incident he first reported from Rob Hall's satellite fax machine, only to be informed by a grim-faced Kathy O'Dowd that I was not welcome at the camp. As Vernon later wrote in the Sunday Times, "I told her she had no right to bar me from a camp my newspaper had paid for. When pressed further, she said she was acting on instructions from Mr. Woodall. She said Shorey had already been thrown out of the camp, and I should follow as I would not be given food or shelter there. My legs were still shaky from the walk, and before deciding whether to fight the edict or leave, I asked for a cup of tea." "No way," came the reply. Ms. O'Dowd walked to the team's Sherpa leader, Ong Dorje, and said audibly, "This is Ken Vernon, one of the ones we told you about. He is to be given no assistance whatsoever. Ong Dorje is a tough, nuggety rock of a man, and we had already shared several glasses of chong, the fiery local brew." I looked at him and said, "Not even a cup of tea?" To his credit, and in the best tradition of Sherpa hospitality, he looked at O'Dowd and said, "Bullshit." He grabbed me by the arm, dragged me into the mess tent, and served up a mug of steaming tea and a plate of biscuits. Following what Owen described as his blood-chilling exchange with Woodall and Farish, the editor was persuaded that the atmosphere of the expedition was deranged and that the Sunday Times staffers, Ken Vernon and Richard Shorey, might be in danger of their lives. Owen therefore instructed Vernon and Shorey to return to South Africa, and the newspaper published a statement declaring that it had rescinded its sponsorship of the expedition, because Woodall had already received the newspaper's money. However, this act was purely symbolic and had almost no impact on his actions on the mountain. Indeed, Woodall refused to relinquish leadership of the expedition or make any kind of compromise, even after he received a message from President Mandela appealing for reconciliation as a matter of national interest. Woodall stubbornly insisted that the Everest climb would proceed as planned, with him firmly at the helm. Back in Cape Town, after the expedition fell apart, February described his disappointment. "Maybe I was naive," he said in a halting voice freighted with emotion. "But I hated growing up under apartheid. Climbing Everest with Andrew and the others would have been a great symbol to show the old ways had broken down." Woodall had no interest in the birth of a new South Africa. He took the dreams of the entire nation and utilized them for his own selfish purposes. Deciding to leave the expedition was the hardest decision of my life. With the departure of February, Hackland, and de Klerk, none of the climbers remaining on the team, aside from the Frenchman Renard, who had joined the expedition merely to be listed on the permit and who climbed independently from the others, with his own Sherpas, had little more than minimal alpine experience. At least two of them, says de Klerk, didn't even know how to put their crampons on. The solo Norwegian, the Taiwanese, and especially the South Africans were frequent topics of discussion in Hall's mess tent. "With so many incompetent people on the mountain," Rob said with a frown one evening in late April, "I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll get through this season without something bad happening up high."